The weather was so gloomy and stormy that being at home didn't alleviate the unease. In my cramped living room, I sat alone, attempting to block out the storm. As if the trees outside were only grass blades, the wind howled through them and bent them to its whim as the rain pounded on the windows. Lightning would occasionally illuminate the sky, and then the house would be jolted by a deep rumble of thunder. Roughly 1 hour ago, the electricity had gone off, turning off all lights in the house except for the little candle I had set out. While insufficient, it served as a step in the right direction. I was startled by the slightest sound, and the pale light threw unsettling shadows on the walls. There was nothing to be scared about. I reminded myself, storms were nothing new to me. I'd weathered them before, however, this one had a distinct vibe. Something terrible was about to happen. The atmosphere was heavy with tension. I attempted to divert my attention by reading, but the weak light from the candles made it impossible to decipher the text. After giving up, I reclined in my chair and relaxed, taking in the rain and wind. An abrupt clattering sound was heard. I was so nervous that I almost knocked over the candle. The noise seemed to originate from the kitchen, even though I wanted to pretend it wasn't happening. When the wind banged something against the house, I knew it wasn't. For a second, I was unsure. Then I stood up and walked gingerly toward the kitchen. The house got chilly as I moved through it, and the shadows got longer and darker. At the threshold of the kitchen, I halted, gazing into the space. It seems like everything was fine at first, but then I made a peculiar observation. The back door, which I thought I had locked, was ajar and swaying in the breeze. I was unable to exhale. I had already locked it. Every time I secure it, I retreated, my thoughts whirling. Is there a burglary at this very moment? Was I alone in the house? The only sound I could make out was the deafening roar of the storm outside. Later on, I became aware of its existence, a little squeak, as if the flooring were about to give way. From upstairs, it was emanating. As I pivoted to gaze up the stairway, my chest raced with fear. I could hardly make out the first few steps because the upstairs was so dark, with every fiber of my being urging me to flee the house. I remained motionless, yet I was unable to depart. Is it possible that someone is up there? Someone who should not have been there. It was impossible for me to simply disappear. I paused to inhale deeply before beginning to mount the stairs, the sound of each step echoing through the empty room. My hand quivered as the candle in my palm danced, painting the walls with ethereal shadows. It was back where it had been when I got to the peak, the increasingly deafening squeak emanating from one of the chambers. I walked gingerly along the corridor, my breath caught in my throat. My bedroom door, like the rear door before it, was ajar. I finished pushing it open and went inside. It was considerably chillier in here than in the rest of the home. Here the wind howls even harder, as if attempting to rip the walls apart. My hands tightened around the candle as I trembled. Something chilling caught my eye in the room's corner. Someone was positioned at the windowsill. It turned its back on me and stood eerily tall and skinny, as if it were listening to the storm outside. Its head hung cocked at an angle. Even though I couldn't see its face, the weight of its ominous presence was palpable. Standing there paralyzed with terror, all I wanted to do was scream and flee. My body, however, was uncooperative. As the creature gently cocked its head in my direction, a face that was completely off-kilter became apparent, and all I could do was stare. Its huge mouth and enormous eyes were too much for it. Its complexion was pale and diseased. With such abnormally huge eyes, it simply stared at me without saying a word. It was as if the room's air had become denser, and I was about to pass out from the pressure. As the person advanced toward me, I mustered up the courage to take action. I nearly dropped the candle as I staggered backward. The figure moved, slowly and methodically, taking another step after another. I sprung to my feet and dashed frantically down the hall, and then back down the stairs. I heard the figure's slow, methodical footsteps behind me, as if it knew there was no way out, and my breath came in irregular gasps. As the oncoming storm slammed me like a ton of bricks, I hurried to the front door and forcefully pulled it open. Forget about it. I sprinted out into the downpour, tripping and falling every step of the way. I was too scared to glance back, so I refrained from doing so. My pulse was thumping as I sprinted through the hail and wind. I continued on my route until I was well beyond the house, and then I stopped when I could see the lights of a nearby house. I sobbed and gasped for oxygen as I collapsed inside after pounding on the door and yelling for aid. I felt the figure from my house watching and waiting, even though I never saw it follow me. The residence was searched by the police, who were summoned by the neighbors, but no evidence was found. There was no one or anything around to provide context for what I witnessed. Still, I was able to make sense of what I witnessed, and to this day, I can sense that ghostly figure waiting for the perfect opportunity to reappear. Whenever a storm rolls in, I attempted to put that horrific night behind me thereafter, but the events remained a looming, dark cloud. That figure would creep up on me whenever it rained. In my fantasies, I could feel those abnormally huge eyes peering into my very being. Getting enough sleep became a real challenge for me. The few times I was able to get any sleep, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, sure that the shadowy figure was hovering above my bed, watching me. The cops had written off my account, saying it was all in my head or caused by stress. Still, I was wiser. It was real. I could feel its presence. With that night's recollection looming over the house like a black cloud, I couldn't stay there any longer. My next step was to pack up and go. Hi, I'm Alex, and I call Houston home. I was in a little Texas town for my cousin's wedding on a rainy night. Even though everyone else left after the wedding, my cousin insisted I remain for a couple extra days so I could join them on their picnic. I consented despite the fact that I was completely bored. For the duration of that evening, I resided alone at a little guest house. I couldn't sit still, and the sky was threatening to open up. Since the afternoon, the rain had been dropping consistently. Now it was becoming heavier, and powerful winds were accompanying it. Aside from the constant patter of rain on the roof and the sound of the wind roaring outside, the guest house was completely alone in the woods. After a long day, I sometimes light up a cigarette and sip a cup of tea. I wanted a cigarette as midnight drew near. I gathered my pack of cigarettes and went outside to get some air, because the cramped space was getting to me. The brisk, moist air greeted me the second I opened the door. The wind was howling through the trees, causing them to tremble menacingly, and the rain was falling in sheets. Strangely lovely and unnerving all at once, the scene was. I took a few steps back from the entrance and lit my cigarette, attempting to dispel the unease that was beginning to take hold of me. As I stood there, smoking and observing the rain, I made a peculiar observation. It was as if the trees bordering the property were alive, moving in some peculiar way. Like skeletal fingers attempting to grasp something, their branches contorted and extended. Despite my assurances that it was only the wind, an uneasy feeling persisted. I felt increasingly observed as I remained there for a longer period of time. I felt the shadows coming closer and closer, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on my neck stood on end. As a result, I peered over the edge of my screen and noticed motion. I turned my head and saw something considerably worse than a shadow at first. A tall, skinny figure emerged from the fields and started approaching towards me. At 6.5 feet tall and abnormally skinny, he possessed long, lanky limbs that moved at an extraordinarily high pace. It seemed as if the rain had no effect on him whatsoever. With deliberate, measured steps, his long legs deftly sliced through the dense undergrowth as he inched closer. Details became more discernible as he approached. Distressed and damp, his garments dangled off his emaciated figure. I couldn't move a muscle, my heart racing, and his pale face and sunken eyes staring down at me were the things that frightened me the most. I stood motionless, gazing at the approaching person. My cigarette, which I had completely forgotten about, burned all the way to the filter held between my shaky fingers. He paused and fixed his vacant gaze on me as he approached within a few yards, and then, very slowly, he lifted a bony hand and waved to me. I was at a loss for words, so I waved back, my hands trembling violently. An overwhelming sense of foreboding swept over me the second I did. Something was terribly wrong. I wanted to turn around and dash back inside, but my legs felt immobile. At that very moment, I detected motion once more, but this time in the other way. Running at the figure was a swarm of little children who materialized out of thin air. However, these kids weren't like any other. They were all completely faceless and black as night. Their movements were creepy and unsettling, as if they were being commanded by an unseen force. All they were was dark silhouettes, the kids, clustered around the towering figure, and then they stared at me while silently waving. To this day, I still can't get over how terrifying it was. Their motions were so coordinated, and their expressionless faces stared at me as though they were anticipating something. My thoughts were racing as I attempted to comprehend the situation. What on earth were these people? Were they even kids? Their movements and sudden appearance in the light gave the impression that they were not constrained by the same laws as the rest of us. Everything came to a halt as the central figure delicately dropped his hand. Tension thickened in the air as the wind weakened and the rain appeared to stop. I had to get out of there, but I was terrified and couldn't look away from the terrible sight before me. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud, unnatural chuckle. Neither the kids nor the specter were to blame. The sound resounded through the woods and seemed to come from everywhere. I was startled to my core by the piercing, high-pitched scream. I couldn't take it anymore. The need to flee for my life surged through me, and I swiftly spun around to run towards the exit. My hands were trembling so terribly that I struggled to turn the doorknob, barely managing to open it. As I sneaked inside, I looked over my shoulder once more. Standing in the rain, the figure remained, yet the kids had already disappeared, just as suddenly as they had emerged. With my heart pounding, I firmly closed and locked the door. I retreated from the door, attempting to steady my breathing, but the terror continued to hold me. The sound of the rain hitting the roof and the wind howling outside were distracting, but the sound of laughing lingered in my ears, causing me to feel uneasy. I turned back in my haste, expecting to see something even worse, but it was really my uncle's footsteps. He had paled up when he came from the main home to see how I was doing, and his expression matched my own fear, not wanting me near the windows. He seized my arm and dragged me into the living room. Before I arrived, he had seen the same figure and he said it wasn't human. He thought the kids were the servants of an otherworldly creature called a jinn. It is extremely dangerous to venture outdoors at night, particularly in such isolated areas. My uncle cautioned me. I hardly slept that night. I jumped at the slightest noise or creak in the house, the children who appeared out of nowhere, and the figure in the rain who had stood motionless and looking at me continued to occupy my thoughts. I departed the following day in the first light of dawn. I preferred not to remain in that guest house for an additional night. I will never forget the crushing fear that consumed me that night, and the image of that figure and those enigmatic children continues to trouble me to this day. I will never again disobey my gut feeling. I have learned to follow my intuition. It is advisable to err on the side of caution when faced with unknown or difficult to explain dangers. My family and I were compelled to relocate to a cramped, old house next to a historic graveyard a few years back. Since our budget was tight, we had to take advantage of the low rent. The mansion had an ominous, forbidding vibe even during the day that we detected the instant we entered. But because we were in a bind, we figured we might as well make do. The sky was already cloudy when we moved in, with thick, dark clouds that seemed to hang low and roll around. The storm started as night fell. The storm began with a low rumble of thunder. Then the clouds parted and torrential rain began to fall within an hour. Outside, the wind grew stronger, tearing across the trees and nearly snapping them. A shiver ran down the spine of the home as the windows shook in their frames. There was no better night than the first. As the hours ticked by, the storm outside intensified. Flashes of lightning illuminated the sky every few minutes, painting unsettling shadows on the walls of my bedroom. I couldn't escape the unsettling sensation that something was peering at me from the shadows, which appeared to be alive and writhing. The house trembled as a rumble of thunder resounded through the deserted halls, resembling the snarl of a hideous beast. Whenever that happened, the wind would rage like a hostile ghost attempting to gain entry, as if on a never-ending drum. The rain beat down on the roof outside. I could hear rain pouring into the gutters and then splashing onto the ground, turning the yard into a maze of muddy rivers. Curious occurrences began to take place within the home as the storm continued to intensify. The lights started out dimming, then went out completely, leaving us in total darkness outside. The sole source of illumination was the lightning. Light blinked through the glass, painting the walls with bizarre, ever-changing patterns. I lay in bed, ensconced in my blankets, desperately attempting to block out the disturbing sounds that appeared to be emanating from all directions. From across the room, I could make out the sound of what seemed like footsteps above me. I tried to convince myself that the pounding in my chest was simply the house sinking. However, I had a sneaking suspicion that wasn't the case. The noise level of the approaching footfall increased as it persisted, till it seemed as though they were hovering directly over my head. My prayer was that it would end, but the sound persisted even as I clenched my eyes shut. Next, it came to a halt with the same abruptness with which it had begun. Knowing that whatever was producing those noises was still there, waiting, made the silence all the more unnerving. Out of nowhere, downstairs came a resounding crash. My heart was pounding, so I bolted from bed and hurried to find out what had transpired. My scared-looking brothers were already at the base of the steps. A huge picture frame in the living room had tumbled from the wall and shattered into the floor. Particles of shattered glass splattered across the floor, and one of them slashed Timmy's chest. It was a blessing that my arm was also lightly sliced. We could have been much worse. As the night progressed, the storm outside appeared to intensify. I feared the windows might break from the ferocity of the rain, and the winds nearly screamed like howling. The trees were sighing and groaning as they tried to bear the weight, and every so often a branch would snap and crash to the earth, making a deafening cracking sound. I dozed off a few times, but the storm wouldn't let me. Thunder would rumble so loudly every time I slept that I thought it was crashing outside my window. In a series of quick bursts, the lightning made it appear to be daylight before plunging the room back into darkness. The shadows on the walls shifted and swayed with every flash, giving the impression that people were lurking beneath the surface. I had the distinct impression that someone was standing at my bedroom doorway at one point. I was on the verge of screaming because, while it was only a dark shadow, it appeared so real. It vanished as I blinked, but the terror was still there. I had a feeling that there was an otherworldly being in the house with us. The following day, the storm remained persistent. The sky remained overcast, and the downpour persisted. As was her habit, my mom got up early to do the wash. She descended to the basement where the washing machine was stored. The temperature was low, the humidity was high, and the long, foreboding shadows that the one light bulb hanging from the ceiling cast slithered across the walls. She had the abrupt realization that she wasn't alone while she sorted through the garments. I stood in the doorway when she turned around, or at least that's what she assumed I was. With expressionless eyes, the person remained still. The apparition remained still in response to her calls for me. Nothing happened to it. It disappeared. I was still in bed when my mom came rushing upstairs to check on me. I didn't find out what had occurred to her until much later, since she was so terrified. Things, however, deteriorated further thereafter. The house was battered for days by the storm. The wind howled like a pack of wolves surrounding the house. As the rain continued to pour down relentlessly, night after night, the walls would tremble from the thunder, and in brief, scary flashes, the lightning would illuminate the apartments. Unidentified shadows, moving objects, and persons that materialized for an instant before vanishing were among the bizarre sightings that began to affect us all. I remember lying in bed one night, trying to get some sleep despite the deafening thunder and lightning outside. Once again, the electricity had gone out, leaving the room completely dark with only the rare flash of lightning to illuminate it. Something creaked in the corner of the room as I was about to fall off to sleep. Fearing what I might see, I cautiously turned my head. I briefly glimpsed the woman from the wall drawing in the wan light cast by a lightning bolt. Her smile was ugly and vicious as she stood there, eyes riveted on mine. My pupils dilated momentarily. Suddenly, she vanished. The fear, however, persisted. My mom made the decision to leave that house the following morning. The tempest continued to rage. Nonetheless, we hurriedly gathered our belongings. A neighbor informed us that the previous owners had discovered the lifeless body of a baby. in the garbage can behind the house, along with what appeared to be the remnants of a sinister ceremony. I couldn't take it anymore. That day, we picked up our car and headed out the door. Unconcerned about the storm and the rain, we merely desired to stay in a secure location. Distant from that dreadful spot, years later, the sound of a thunderstorm still brings back the chills of those evenings spent in that haunted house, where an even more dreadful presence lurked within.